Right now, in the United States, a 40-year-old man living in poverty has the exact same life expectancy as a man living in Sudan.
Which is just, I mean, it is a staggering thing to wrap your head
It
around.
really is.
Yeah.
Let that sink in for a second for everyone listening. Because, in the wealthiest nation in human history, a country that spends more on healthcare per capita than literally anywhere else on the planet, the poorest men are dying nearly 15 years earlier than the richest.
Yeah, the data points to a 14.6-year gap, to be exact.
Exactly. And so it is not just an economic divide anymore. It has become, well, a biological one. So how did we get here? And more importantly, what does a statistic like that say about the invisible rules that are sort of governing our lives?
Right, the unspoken rules.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is your morning roundup, where we take the absolute fire hose of information that is the modern internet, the articles, the data sets, the cultural commentary, and we just distill it down into something you can actually use.
Because there's so much noise out there.
So much noise. And our mission today is to take a massive, seemingly disconnected stack of sources and find the hidden thread that ties them all together. And I have to tell you, the stack sitting on the desk today is wild.
It is definitely one of the more intense collections we have looked at.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we are looking at that shocking economic data on life expectancy. We are digging into some proposed cryptocurrency legislation sitting in Congress right now that sounds like, I do not know, absolute science fiction.
It really does. It sounds completely made up.
Right. Plus, we have some fiery cultural commentary on rural America, deeply traditionalist religious views on marriage, and the rise of these uncompromising hardline political movements in both the UK and the US.
And on the surface, if you are just scrolling through your feed and reading these headlines in isolation, they look like entirely separate conversations.
Totally unrelated.
Right. You have public health over here, crypto finance over there, theology and fringe politics somewhere else. But that is the value of stepping back and looking at the aggregate.
Right. Which is what we do here.
Exactly. Because when you lay all these sources out on the table side by side, a massive, undeniable theme emerges. It is almost like a heat map.
Oh, I like that analogy. So what is the theme?
The theme connecting every single one of these disparate sources today is the collapse of the old social contract.
Social contract. Wow.
Yeah. Across economics, governance, culture, and faith, the voices in these sources are all pointing to the exact same conclusion. And that is that the rules we all thought we were playing by, the rules of the republic, the rules of upward mobility, the rules of civic engagement, they're either completely dead, fundamentally rigged against the average person, or actively being rewritten in real time by the people who hold the levers of power.
That concept of a social contract is something we throw around a lot. But I mean, it really just means the unspoken agreement that if you play by the rules, contribute to society, and obey the laws, the system will offer you a degree of fairness.
Fairness, stability, protection.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. And what we are seeing across the board is this pervasive feeling that the ground is shifting beneath our feet, like the contract has just been voided.
It has been shredded, really.
So today, we are going to map exactly how and why that is happening. But before we get into the heavy mechanics of this, I want to toss it over to you for a crucial framing note. Because, well, we are pulling from some very intense material today, and we really need to be clear about how we are handling it.
Absolutely. And this is vital for you, the listener, to keep in mind as we navigate this deep dive. The goal of this show is to act as a mirror to the current media and cultural landscape.
Right, we just reflect what is out there.
Precisely. And to do that accurately and honestly, today's stack includes highly charged, provocative, and in some cases, extremely radical political and cultural viewpoints from various ends of the spectrum.
Stuff that is really going to push some buttons.
Oh, absolutely. We are going to be unpacking intense demographic anxieties, aggressive political rhetoric, and controversial theological claims. So our mandate here is impartial reporting.
We are not taking sides.
We are not here to endorse any of the ideologies, political parties, or worldviews presented in these sources. We are here to present the information to you exactly as the sources argue it. We want to map the philosophical mechanisms behind their arguments and then, let you decide how to feel about it.
Because sometimes truly understanding the world requires looking squarely at ideas that challenge your worldview.
Exactly. We are simply the guides laying out the map. You are the jury.
Okay, so let's start mapping. Because to really understand why the social contract feels so thoroughly broken right now, We cannot just look at the symptoms on the surface. We have to dig down to the bedrock of the system itself.
The very foundation.
Right, and we are going to start with the very structure of the American Republic. I was reading this fascinating piece you brought in from Mia's Media, and their core argument is going to sound incredibly radical to anyone who remembers their high school civics classes.
It really throws all of that out the window.
It does. They are making the claim that the United States is no longer operating under the 1787 Constitution. They argue that we are actually living in what they call the Fourth or Fifth Republic.
Which is a bold claim.
Very bold. And they trace this massive invisible shift back to the New Deal in the 1930s. The argument is that the New Deal essentially created a sprawling administrative state where executive alphabet agencies now bypass the traditional legislative process entirely.
Right. And it is a profound historical argument. It hinges entirely on how we define government. The source leans heavily on a writer from the 1930s named Garrett Garrett.
Garrett, okay.
Yeah, he belonged to what historians call the Old Right. And Garrett wrote a brilliant, frankly chilling essay in 1938 titled The Revolution Was.
The revolution was past tense.
Past tense, exactly. His premise was that conservatives and traditionalists at the time were constantly looking forward. They were bracing themselves, warning the public that if they were not careful, a revolution was coming down the road to destroy the American constitutional system.
But they were looking the wrong way.
That is Garrett's point. They were standing on the barricades, gazing in the wrong direction. The revolution was already behind them. It had happened in the night during the sheer panic of the Great Depression.
Because while everyone was distracted by simple economic survival, the rules changed. Because, during a crisis, people do not care about the separation of powers. They care about bread lines and bank runs.
Precisely. You do not care about constitutional theory when you cannot feed your kids. And the argument here is that the New Deal fundamentally altered the relationship between the citizen and the state.
How so? Like structurally?
Structurally, think about the original constitutional design. It was incredibly slow and cumbersome by design. It required the House, the Senate, and the President to all agree, with the Supreme Court acting as a referee.
Lots of friction built in.
Exactly, intentional friction. But during the 1930s, that was deemed way too slow to manage a modern industrialized economy in a crisis. So we saw the birth of the administrative state. Congress basically began delegating its lawmaking power to executive agencies.
Oh, I see. So instead of Congress passing a highly specific law about, say, workplace safety, they just pass a very broad law creating an agency.
Yes. They create the agency and then grant that agency the power to write the specific rules.
Wow.
But it did not stop there. Those agencies were also given the power to investigate violations of their own rules and often to hold internal tribunals to penalize violators.
Wait, so you have the legislative, executive, and judicial functions all rolled into one unelected bureaucratic body?
According to the source, yes. And that effectively ended the First Republic. The checks and balances were bypassed, replaced by an apparatus of administrative experts.
It makes me think of a biological analogy. It is like a hermit crab living in the shell of a dead animal.
Oh, that is a great way to look at it.
Right. From the outside, if you just look at the shape of the shell, it looks exactly like the original creature. It has the same ridges, the same calcified structure, the same colors. But the substance inside, the living, breathing organism that is actually driving the shell around the ocean floor, is a totally different species.
It is entirely different DNA inside.
Exactly. So we still have the White House. We still have the Capitol building with its majestic dome. We still have the Supreme Court justices in their robes. The shell of the 1787 Republic is perfectly preserved. But the substance moving it is this modern administrative leviathan.
Which is a terrifying thought for a lot of people.
It is, and it brings up a terrifying question for you, the listener, though. If this is true, if the 1787 Constitution is essentially a dead shell, why do politicians still go through the elaborate pageantry?
That is the million-dollar question.
Like, why do presidents still stand on the Capitol steps, put their hand on a historic Bible, and swear solemn oaths to uphold and defend a document that, according to this argument, hasn't actively governed the country for nearly a century?
That is the pivotal question, and the source actually addresses this by referencing the dystopian author Aldous Huxley.
Brave New World.
Exactly. It is entirely about maintaining the psychological illusion of continuity.
Oh, to keep people calm.
Right. Think about it. If a political leader steps up to a podium and openly declares, hey, the old republic is dead, the Constitution is obsolete, and we are now installing a new system of governance managed by unelected, credentialed bureaucrats, what happens?
People panic. Absolute chaos.
The populace will panic, they will revolt, or at the very least, they will completely withdraw their compliance. But if you keep all the hallowed slogans, if you maintain the quaint old form, the messy elections, the fierce parliamentary debates, the solemn Supreme Court rulings, you pacify the public.
You give it a show.
You maintain a state of what the source calls nonviolent totalitarianism.
Nonviolent totalitarianism. So it is essentially comforting theater.
It is exactly that. The forms of democracy continue to exist, but the actual substance of policy, the real power, is dictated by a ruling oligarchy of administrators, financial elites, and judicial activists who simply reinterpret the old constitutional words to mean whatever they need them to mean in the present moment.
Like stretching definitions.
Exactly. Think about how the Commerce Clause has been stretched over the decades to justify federal regulation over almost every aspect of human life. The oath to the Constitution becomes a ceremonial ritual, much like the British monarch opening Parliament.
Right. The monarch reads a speech they did not write, outlining laws they did not draft.
It is pure ceremony. Maintaining the illusion of the old republic keeps the public believing they still have their hands firmly in the steering wheel, even while the car is basically driving itself.
And while that legal and governmental shell game is happening at the top, the system is actively, physically dividing the people living inside it down at the bottom. Which brings us back to that staggering statistic I mentioned at the top of the show, from the Economics Explained piece.
The life expectancy gap.
Right, a 14.6-year life expectancy gap.
Yeah.
I was reading that, and the numbers absolutely stopped me in my tracks. Because we generally assume health inequality is just a matter of logistics. Who can afford a better doctor, who can afford to shop at Whole Foods instead of the dollar store.
It is the standard assumption, yeah.
But the source points to a British epidemiological study that flips that conventional wisdom completely on its head. Can you walk me through the mechanics of this Whitehall study? Because it suggests the issue isn't just about healthcare access at all.
The Whitehall study is one of the most important pieces of public health research of the 20th century, and it is crucial to understanding this gap. It was led by a researcher named Michael Marmot.
Marmot, right.
And he studied British civil servants working in Whitehall, which is essentially the center of the UK government in London. Now, the brilliant thing about this study is that it controlled for the usual suspects.
So they weren't destitute.
No, these were not people living in abject poverty. They were not unemployed. They all had stable, white-collar government jobs. Furthermore, because they were in the UK, they all had exactly the same access to the National Health Service.
Right, so the baseline was completely leveled. You could not blame the health outcomes on a lack of health insurance or an inability to see a doctor.
Exactly. Yet Marmot found something astounding. The people at the very bottom of the office hierarchy, the clerks, the typists, the messengers, were dying from heart disease and other chronic illnesses at 3 times the rate of the senior administrators and department heads at the top of the hierarchy.
3 times the rate, just based on their job title.
Yes. And when they adjusted the data for lifestyle factors like smoking or obesity, a massive gap still remained. The hidden killer, the invisible mechanism driving this physical division, was not a lack of healthcare or bad diets. It was a lack of control.
A lack of control.
It was the biological impact of social status.
So how does a lack of control actually kill you? Like, what is the physical mechanism there?
It comes down to chronic stress and what biologists call allostatic load.
Allostatic load. Okay, break that down for me.
Think about a senior manager's day. They have high demands, certainly. They have to make big decisions, but they also have immense agency. If they want to take a long lunch to decompress, they can.
Or close their door.
Right. If they need to step away for a doctor's appointment or just close their office door for an hour, they have the authority to do so. They dictate the flow of their own time. Now compare that to a lower-level worker. Their day is heavily monitored.
Every minute is tracked.
Exactly. They are dictated to. They might have to ask permission to use the restroom. They have no say over how their tasks are assigned or when their deadlines are set.
They are essentially a cog in someone else's machine.
Yes. And that constant, unrelenting experience of having absolutely no agency over your own movements generates a perpetual state of low-level physiological stress. The body's fight-or-flight system is constantly engaged, dripping cortisol and adrenaline into the bloodstream.
And over time, that just wears you down.
In the short term, cortisol is great. It helps you run from a bear. But when it is pumping through your veins every day for 30 years because you have a micromanaging boss and zero autonomy, it becomes a toxin. It elevates your blood pressure, It causes systemic inflammation, it suppresses your immune system, and it accelerates cellular aging. Over the course of decades, it silently destroys the cardiovascular system.
So poverty and low status, in this context, are not just economic conditions. They are literal physical toxins that break down the human body.
Exactly.
And here is where the economic math of this becomes incredibly brutal, and where it ties back to the collapse of the social contract. Because wealth doesn't just buy you a more comfortable life or a nicer house. Wealth buys you time.
Time is the ultimate asset.
And in the financial system we currently have, a system built on asset inflation time is the single most important ingredient for wealth to compound. The source lays out a fascinating timeline. They point out that the S&P 500 is up roughly 2,300% since 1970.
Which is massive growth.
Yeah. Massive.
Yeah.
So in our current economy, if you have assets like stocks or real estate, every extra year you live is another year your portfolio compounds exponentially. Let's look at the math here. An affluent white-collar worker retires at 65. Because of high status, low biological stress, and great care, he lives to be 85.
20 good years.
Right. And during those final 20 years, his portfolio doesn't just sit there. It explodes in value due to compound interest. When he eventually passes away, he leaves a massive inheritance to his children. And here is the kicker. Because he lives so long, his children are usually in their 50s or 60s when they inherit the money.
They are already completely established.
Exactly. They don't need to spend it on survival. They invest it, and the wealth compounds even further.
But the timeline for the poorer man is violently truncated. Because of the biological toll we just discussed, the manual laborer or the low-status worker dies in his late 60s or early 70s. He has 15 fewer years for any modest savings to grow.
He runs out of time.
He dies before he can accumulate anything meaningful. And if he does manage to leave a small life insurance policy or a tiny inheritance, the source notes the tragic irony of when that money arrives. It usually goes to children who are in their 20s or 30s, who are often heavily burdened with their own debt or struggling to establish themselves.
So it does not get invested.
No, the money is immediately vaporized on basic survival. Paying off high-interest credit cards, covering a medical bill, catching up on a mortgage, rather than being put into the market to grow. The mathematical miracle of compound interest works beautifully for the long-lived rich, and it completely bypasses the short-lived poor.
Which makes the standard political solutions we hear peddled on cable news seem incredibly tone-deaf, if not outright predatory. I mean, we constantly hear politicians from both sides of the aisle say, oh, the math of Social Security is broken, people are living longer, so we need to raise the retirement age to 68 or 70 to save the system.
But that is a statistical illusion.
Right. Because if you raise the retirement age universally, you are mathematically punishing the poor. The affluent worker with the corner office can comfortably type on a laptop until they are 70, and then they'll live to 85, collecting 15 years of state pension.
While the manual laborer is broken down.
Exactly. The guy whose knees and back are physically broken down by 60 struggles to reach that new finish line of 68. And then mathematically, based on that 14.6-year life expectancy gap, they die just 2 or 3 years later.
It is a devastating reality. The rules of the system are applied equally on paper, which gives the illusion of fairness. But because the biological reality underneath is so wildly unequal, the equal application of the rule results in a massive systemic wealth transfer from the bottom to the top.
The poor subsidize the rich.
They do. The poor end up paying into a pension system their entire lives, only to die before they can collect, effectively subsidizing the 2-decade-long retirements of the wealthy. And the source also contrasts two proposed policy solutions to this wealth gap. They call them baby bonds versus Trump accounts.
Yeah, I saw that. Break down the difference in mechanisms there.
Well, baby bonds are a progressive proposal where the government would create a funded investment account for every child at birth. The key mechanism is that it is means-tested.
So not everyone gets the same amount.
Right. The poorest children receive heavy, continuous government top-ups throughout their childhood, with the explicit goal of mathematically closing the racial and class wealth gap by the time they turn 18.
Okay, and what about the Trump accounts?
The alternative proposal, loosely termed Trump accounts in the source, functions very differently. It would provide a flat, equal seed deposit for every child at birth. But then it relies on the child's family, or eventually their employers, to add voluntary contributions to it over time.
Which obviously benefits the people who already have money.
Exactly. The source's analysis points out that the latter solution would simply mirror and exacerbate existing inequalities. Wealthy families with disposable income would max out the tax-advantaged contributions every year, turning that seed money into millions by adulthood. Poor families, struggling to buy groceries, could not add a dime.
So it is a perfect illustration of how the mechanisms of the state, that Fourth Republic we discuss, continually fail to bridge the gaps they claim to be managing
Yeah.
because they just refuse to acknowledge the underlying realities of time and capital.
The rules are written for a reality that does not apply to everyone.
Now, if the physical game is rigged against the poor because they literally run out of time, you would think the financial system would offer some kind of stabilizing anchor.
You would hope so.
But the exact same mechanism of rule breaking, of rewriting the foundational agreements, is happening with our currency. Let's move to the next part of the stack. We are looking at a video breakdown from Heresy Financial that analyzes a piece of proposed legislation called the American Reserve Modernization Act, or ARMA.
This one is truly mind-bending.
It really is. The stated goal of this bill is for the United States Treasury to systematically buy 1 million Bitcoin over the next 5 years. That represents roughly 4.7% of the entire global supply of Bitcoin.
Which is a massive chunk.
Huge. And the logic is to bring the U.S. government's Bitcoin holdings into proportion with its historical percentage of the global gold supply. But the truly crazy part isn't the Bitcoin itself. It is the financial gymnastics of how they plan to pay for it without technically taxing the public or issuing new treasury debt.
It is an absolute masterclass in financial sleight of hand, and it perfectly illustrates the concept of the administrative state rewriting reality. The source details a mechanism called the gold revaluation loophole.
The gold revaluation loophole.
Okay. To understand how this works, we have to look at the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. The U.S. Treasury currently holds about 261.5 million troy ounces of physical gold, mostly in places like Fort Knox.
Sitting in a vault.
Right. But legally, on the government's accounting books, that gold is valued at $42.22 an ounce.
Which is absurd. Because anyone who has looked at a financial ticker recently knows the spot price of gold is closer to $2,500, or, in their projections, reaching toward $4,500 an ounce.
Exactly. That $42 price was set way back in the early 1970s when Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard. So under the proposed ARMA legislation, the Treasury would use its administrative authority to legally revalue its gold holdings to reflect the modern open market price.
Just unilaterally update the books.
Yes. Let's say they revalue it to match current market highs. Overnight, the government creates $1 trillion in paper value out of thin air simply by updating a spreadsheet. The Treasury would then print new paper gold certificates reflecting this massive increase in value and hand those certificates over to the Federal Reserve.
Okay, let me use a local analogy to see if I have the mechanics of this right, because this sounds insane.
It is, but go ahead.
It is essentially like me waking up, looking at Zillow, and realizing the house I bought 10 years ago has gone up in value by $100,000. So I write a certificate on a napkin saying, I have $100,000 in equity. I hand that napkin to my wife, and somehow she uses the authority of that napkin to instantly wire real spendable dollars into our checking account so we can go buy a sports car.
That is a remarkably accurate analogy.
Except in this case, the government is doing it with the global economy.
Yes. The Federal Reserve takes these newly minted gold certificates from the Treasury. To balance their own complex accounting books, the Fed simply keystrokes $1 trillion into existence and deposits it into the Treasury General account.
Just keystrokes it.
They literally type a 1 followed by 12 zeros into a computer terminal. The money is created out of nothing, backed only by the newly claimed paper value of the old gold. And the politicians championing this bill go on television and claim it is revenue neutral.
Revenue neutral.
Right. They tell the public, look, we are securing the financial future of the country with a Bitcoin reserve, and it will not cost the taxpayers a single dime in new taxes.
But I have to push back on this, because it feels like a violation of the basic laws of physics. You and I both know that injecting 1 trillion brand new dollars into the economy to buy an asset isn't free.
There is no free lunch.
Right. The energy has to come from somewhere. Doesn't that just mean we all end up paying for it through the invisible, silent tax of inflation?
You are entirely correct to push back, and the source explicitly confirms this mechanism. Think about the physical flow of that money. When the government prints $1 trillion and uses it to buy Bitcoin on the open market, those new dollars go straight into the pockets of the people and institutions selling the Bitcoin.
Who then have all this new cash.
Exactly. Those sellers now have $1 trillion in newly minted fiat currency. What do they do with it? They spend it in the real economy. They buy houses, they buy cars, they invest in stocks, they buy groceries.
Pushing up prices for everyone else.
You now have a massive influx of new money chasing the exact same amount of physical goods and services that existed yesterday. The inevitable mathematical result is the dilution of purchasing power. The dollars already sitting in your savings account become worth slightly less.
Because there are more dollars in the pool.
Exactly. So while the taxpayer doesn't see a line item on their IRS return that says tax for Bitcoin reserve funding, they pay for it every single time they go to the supermarket and eggs are 50 cents more expensive, or every time they try to bid on a home and find the prices jumped by 20%.
It is a hidden, systemic extraction of wealth from the middle and lower classes. The very people we just established are losing their life expectancy, all to fund an elite financial maneuver at the macro level.
It is the ultimate insider game. The rules of fiat currency are simply bent and warped to accommodate whatever the state needs at any given moment.
And speaking of bending the rules, there is a bizarre, almost tragicomic cultural reflection of this exact same ethos in another source we pulled today from Akkad Daily. They briefly touched on something called the enhanced games.
Oh, this is a wild story.
For you listening who might have missed this news cycle, this was a billionaire-funded attempt to create an alternative to the traditional Olympics. The premise was to strip away all the anti-doping regulations.
The steroid Olympics.
Yes. Athletes were openly allowed and theoretically encouraged to use performance-enhancing drugs, steroids, whatever scientific cocktails they wanted.
And it is a fascinating micro-study of our current cultural psychology. When the traditional rules, whether that is the rules of fiat currency requiring balanced budgets or the rules of natural human biological limits, when they fail to yield the dramatic, accelerating, exponential results that a hypermodern society desires, what is the immediate response?
We just hacked the system.
We openly embrace engineered enhancement. We abandon the pretense of natural limits. We print $1 trillion out of thin air to engineer a strategic asset reserve. We pump athletes full of chemicals to engineer shattered world records. It is the belief that biology and economics are just code that can be hacked by the right elite engineers.
But the punchline of the enhanced games, the part that really highlights the hubris of this era, is that it basically flopped. From what the source detailed, only one actual world record was broken.
Which is highly ironic.
And apparently several clean athletes who refused to take the steroids still managed to show up and beat the enhanced athletes in their events. It is almost poetic. You can rewrite the rule book, you can inject all the artificial enhancement you want, you can print the money, but sometimes the hard realities of human physiology or market economics refuse to cooperate with the engineering.
And when the engineering fails to deliver the promised utopia, the people living inside the system begin to realize the contract is broken. Which brings us to the human fallout of all this.
Right. How is this actually impacting people?
We have mapped out an administrative state operating outside the bounds of the original Constitution, an expanding wealth and health divide that is literally shortening lives, and a financially engineered economy that silently dilutes the purchasing power of the average citizen through inflation. So how are the people, particularly the younger generations who have to inherit this machinery, reacting to a society where the game feels this rigged?
The reaction, according to our sources, is profound, paralyzing disillusionment. A commentator known as Richard IV highlights what he terms a massive youth crisis. He notes that over 1 million young people in the UK alone are currently out of work and out of education.
1 million young people.
They're essentially opting out of the system. He frames this through the lens of the shredded Burkean contract.
Ah, Edmund Burke.
Right. For context, Edmund Burke was an 18th century philosopher who famously argued that society is not just a temporary business arrangement. It is a partnership, a multi-generational contract between the living, the dead, and those who are yet to be born.
It is a beautiful concept. Burke's idea was that we inherit institutions, infrastructure, and cultural norms from our ancestors, and we have a sacred duty to maintain them and pass them on in better condition to our grandchildren.
Right, like an inheritance you have to steward.
Exactly. If a town inherits a beautiful 100-year-old park built by their great-grandparents, the Burkean contract says the current residents must pay the taxes and put in the labor to maintain it, even if it is inconvenient, so the next generation can enjoy it.
But the argument here is that this contract has been completely shredded in favor of pure, immediate, selfish individualism. The political and economic elders aren't planting trees whose shade they will never sit in. Instead, they are harvesting the entire forest today to prop up their own pensions and portfolios, leaving a barren field for the youth.
And that barren field has given rise to a very specific and deeply frustrated sociological archetype. The cultural commentator R.N. McIntyre introduces a concept he calls the failib.
The failib. This one was so interesting to me.
It requires a bit of recent sociological backstory to fully grasp. Over the last decade, political commentators often talked about the hicklib.
The hicklib, okay, define that.
It was a pejorative term for a progressive person living in a rural area who loudly adopted hyper-urban left-wing activist talking points. The theory was that they did this to artificially elevate their own moral and social status above their conservative neighbors, essentially acting out the rituals of a cosmopolitan elite culture they didn't actually belong to.
Which is a signal status.
Exactly. But McIntyre argues that the failib is an evolution of this, born not just out of cultural signaling, but out of pure economic failure.
I found this profile fascinating. The failib is the person who did exactly what the system told them to do. They played by the rules of the old contract. They got straight A's in high school. They went to a prestigious, or at least a very expensive university.
They checked all the boxes.
All the boxes. They dutifully memorized, internalized, and repeated all the approved, progressive, humanities-driven ideology of their professors. They took on $100,000 in non-dischargeable student loan debt because they were explicitly promised that this credential was a golden ticket.
The promise of the knowledge economy.
Right. It was supposed to guarantee them a comfortable email job in corporate HR, a nice apartment in a major cultural hub like Chicago or Brooklyn, and, crucially, a permanent social status elevated above the working class.
But the rules of the macroeconomy changed. The zero interest rate environment that funded the massive expansion of the corporate HR industrial complex ended. The tech companies laid people off. The humanities degrees aggressively lost their market value.
The bubble burst.
And the failib ended up unemployed, heavily burdened with insurmountable debt, and forced to move back home. They end up taking a retail management job or working as a barista at a Starbucks back in the very same rural or suburban towns they desperately thought they had escaped.
McIntyre points out a brilliant, almost cruel reversal of a classic social dynamic here. In previous decades, college students in university towns used to look down on the permanent local residents. They derogatorily called them townies.
Right, the town versus gown divide.
Exactly. The university students viewed themselves as the transient, upwardly mobile elite who would use the town for 4 years, get their degree, and move on to rule the world, while the townies were viewed as uneducated people stuck in place. Now, the economic tables have completely turned.
It is totally inverted.
The failib is stuck in the rural town, wearing an apron, serving oat milk lattes to the very working class people, the plumbers, the diesel mechanics, the electricians who didn't go to college, who didn't take on debt, who learned a tangible trade.
And who now actually have the wealth.
Exactly. They possess higher economic stability, home ownership, and higher social status within the community. The failib is economically forced to serve the exact demographic of people they were socially conditioned by their universities to despise.
It is a recipe for deep, deep resentment.
So here is where I have to ask about the psychology of this archetype. Is the intense progressive activism we see from this demographic genuinely about deeply held ideological belief? Or is it just pure, unfiltered economic frustration manifesting as cultural superiority?
That is the core question.
Like when the failib is standing behind the counter at Chipotle, glaring at a customer wearing work boots. Are they genuinely angry at the abstract concept of the patriarchy, or are they just furious that they bought a $100,000 lottery ticket from a university that didn't pay off, and now they feel trapped?
McIntyre argues it is almost entirely the latter, though it is heavily cloaked in the academic language of the former. They desperately need a moral explanation for their economic failure.
Because it hurts to admit you got played.
Exactly. Human ego makes it incredibly difficult to admit, I made a terrible financial decision, I was scammed by the university credentialing system, and my degree is practically worthless in the marketplace. Therefore, they have to believe that unseen systemic forces of oppression are keeping them down.
And that their working-class neighbors are somehow complicit in that oppression.
Right. It dignifies their rage. It turns personal economic failure into a righteous political struggle. But the tragic irony, as the source points out, is that their resentment is directed horizontally and downward. They are mad at the working class around them, rather than upward at the institutional elites, the university administrators, and the financial systems that sold them the false promise in the first place.
And when you have an entire generation of educated youth feeling betrayed and trapped in debt, and simultaneously a working class that feels abandoned, heavily taxed, and culturally mocked by those same institutions, the polite veneer of traditional political discourse vanishes.
The civility is gone.
Which brings us to perhaps the most highly charged segment of our deep dive. The sources we are analyzing reveal a fierce, radicalizing right-wing reaction bubbling up rapidly across both the U.S. and Europe. And again, a strong reminder to you listening, we are strictly outlining the views and arguments presented by these specific sources.
We are just reporting what is being discussed.
Right. We are mapping out what is being said in these spheres of influence to understand the tectonic shifts in the political landscape.
It is essential to map this because the rhetoric is shifting fundamentally. A major focal point in several of the sources is the concept of demographic replacement, which is moving from fringe internet forums into more mainstream political commentary.
I noticed that. It is becoming much more vocal.
In the UK context, we looked at an interview on NXR Studios featuring commentators Paul Weston and Calvin Robinson. Their core argument is entirely demographic and mathematical. They cite statistics claiming that the native British birth rate has plummeted to roughly 1.2 children per woman, or even lower in some areas.
Which is well below the 2.1 replacement rate.
Yes. Simultaneously, they argue that the birth rate of Islamic immigrant communities in the UK is significantly higher, between 2.5 and 3.0. Based on projecting these specific trajectories forward, their thesis is that by 2050 or 2060, native Britons will be a demographic minority in their own historical homeland.
And we hear a very similar, albeit more localized, version of this narrative regarding the United States from commentator Brianna Mell. She argues that a demographic and cultural takeover is happening right now, not just in liberal coastal cities, but deep in red states.
Right. She specifically mentions Texas.
She points to rapidly growing suburban areas like Frisco, Texas. Her claim is that massive amounts of foreign money, specifically Saudi funds funneled through layers of disguised LLCs, are being used to quietly buy up old Christian churches and sprawling tracts of Texas farmland.
To build enclaves.
Exactly. The purpose, according to her argument, is to build massive Islamic compounds and mosques. Her thesis is that these groups aren't looking to integrate into the classic American melting pot, but rather to establish localized dominance and enclave communities.
The crucial element to understand here is not just the demographic math they are presenting, but who these commentators blame for this situation.
Oh, right. Who's the villain in their narrative?
They do not primarily aim their vitriol at the immigrants themselves, who they view as simply taking advantage of an open door. They reserve their deepest anger for the mainstream political establishment, what they uniformly refer to as the uniparty.
The uniparty, so left and right combined.
Yes. In the UK, they view the Conservative Tories and the Labour Party not as opposing forces, but as essentially identical entities complicit in managing this demographic shift. In the US, they view establishment Republicans and establishment Democrats the exact same way.
What is the supposed motive for the uniparty to do this, according to the sources?
The synthesis of their argument is that the ruling administrative class intentionally fosters an environment of mass migration and state dependence. The goal, they argue, is to dilute historic national identities, weaken community resilience, and maintain a fractured populace that is entirely reliant on the administrative state to manage the resulting cultural friction.
Divide and conquer, basically.
Exactly. And because of this total visceral disillusionment with the establishment, we are seeing the rise of entirely new, much more hardline political vehicles that reject the old rules of engagement. Look at the UK. Historically, over the last decade, Nigel Farage has been the undisputed face of the populist right, driving Brexit and now leading his Reform UK party.
But the sources we are looking at today, from commentators like Richard IV and Sargon of Akkad, are arguing that Farage is now viewed by the true hardline right as entirely too mainstream.
Too soft, essentially.
They see him as too libertarian, too focused on traditional conservative talking points like free markets, deregulation, and tax cuts. In an era of perceived civilizational collapse, they argue that arguing about marginal tax rates is akin to rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
They want a much harder line.
Instead, they are championing a new, much smaller, far more radical party called Restore Britain, led by a man named Rupert Lowe.
Restore Britain is highly significant to watch because it actively leans into hardline identity politics in a way that Nigel Farage historically tries to avoid. They are not just arguing about securing the border to protect local wages. They are openly arguing about civilizational survival, historical continuity, and explicit national identity.
They view themselves as the only authentic opposition to that Fourth Republic we talked about.
And predictably, the mainstream media and the political establishment are reacting aggressively to neutralize this threat. The sources point out that legacy papers like the Daily Mail are running massive smear campaigns, unearthing old photos of minor, low-level party members allegedly doing Nazi salutes.
Oh.
The strategy is to brand the entire Restore Britain movement as toxic and untouchable to the moderate voter. Furthermore, it is interesting to note how these right-wing sources view the political left. They completely dismiss prominent left-wing commentators like Hassan Piker.
Oh, really? They do not see him as the opposition?
No, they don't view him as genuine anti-establishment opposition at all. They simply view him as a well-paid mouthpiece for the establishment status quo, managing the anger of the left so it doesn't threaten the actual administrative state.
But I look at this landscape, and I have to push back on the actual viability of these radical movements. If these hardline groups are truly gaining the ground they claim to be, if the public is as angry as they say, why are they constantly fracturing?
That is a very fair point.
We see it constantly in the sources and in the news. Endless internal purity tests, vicious debates over who is a true conservative, purging prominent members for past comments that weren't radical enough. If they truly believe the house is on fire and the civilizational contract is burning, why are they spending all their time standing in the driveway arguing over the color of the fire extinguisher?
It is the inherent paradox and, frankly, the fatal instability of purely reactionary movements throughout history. When a political faction is defined entirely by what it is against the establishment, against immigration, against modernity, against the uniparty, it fundamentally struggles to build a cohesive, positive vision of what it is for.
Without a core positive vision, they just eat each other.
Exactly. Without a unifying, transcendent, affirmative principle, the movement inevitably turns its paranoia inward. It begins searching for heretics and spies within its own ranks. The internal purity tests become a psychological substitute for actual political power.
Because it is easier to win a Twitter fight than an election.
Yes. Since they cannot defeat the massive administrative state, they satisfy their desire for victory by defeating a slightly more moderate faction within their own subreddit. They isolate themselves to remain ideologically pure, which simultaneously ensures they never build the broad, messy, compromising coalition necessary to actually win elections and govern a country.
That is a fascinating historical insight. It is the revolution eating its own children before it even takes power. And it perfectly explains the massive pivot we see in our final set of sources today. Because for many of the voices in this stack, politics itself is viewed as a dead end.
A total waste of time in their eyes.
Right. Voting for a new party, even a radical one, isn't enough to fix a broken social contract. The ultimate reaction to the collapse of modernity isn't political organization. It is a total, uncompromising retreat into hardline, traditional faith and a complete restructuring of personal, intimate life.
Exactly. When the macro systems fail, people look to the eternal. We turn to a deeply provocative theological argument presented by Right Response Ministries. They are fundamentally challenging modern mainstream Christian advice regarding lifestyle and marriage.
What are they positing here?
The hosts unpack a highly specific, traditionalist reading of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19. Their core theological assertion is that celibacy, the ability to live a content life without sexual desire or the need for marriage, is not a universal ideal that anyone can achieve through sheer willpower or dedication to a career.
Okay.
They argue it is an exceedingly rare supernatural gift granted by God to perhaps 0.1% of the human population. Therefore, they argue, the vast, vast majority of men and women are biologically and spiritually commanded to marry.
And they use incredibly strong, uncompromising language here. They say that for the average person, singleness is a curse.
A curse?
It is not a season of self-discovery. It is an affliction of loneliness, temptation, and eventual moral failure. Because of this belief, they argue that men must marry young, ideally in their very early 20s, and start families immediately. They explicitly reject the modern cultural narrative that tells young people to delay marriage in order to build a career, travel, or achieve financial stability first.
And this doctrinal stance naturally leads them into a fierce two-front critique of the modern church infrastructure. On one hand, they heavily criticize the Catholic discipline of mandatory priestly celibacy.
Because it goes against that 0.1% stat.
Right. Their argument is that by forcing thousands of men who do not possess this exceedingly rare supernatural gift into lifelong celibacy, the institution inevitably breeds deep, systemic, and hidden sin. But they don't spare the Protestant side either.
Who do they target there?
They launch a blistering attack on modern, culturally engaged Protestant figures, specifically naming the late Tim Keller, who famously pastored a massive church in Manhattan. They accuse Keller and his theological peers of telling young, ambitious Christians to view their singleness as a gift and to intentionally delay marriage in order to pursue high-powered secular careers in cultural hubs like New York City or Washington, D.C. The source views this as outright theological malpractice. They argue it was a strategy designed to fill urban church pews with wealthy, single professionals, but it came at the catastrophic cost of those individuals' spiritual and moral health, leaving them unmarried and childless in their 30s.
But, and this is where the strategy gets incredibly Machiavellian and fascinating, they offer one highly specific exception to their strict marry young rule.
Oh, the vanguard strategy, yes.
They claim that while 90 to 95% of Christian men should reject the cities, move to the country, marry young, have large families, and work stable blue-collar jobs, there is a tiny fraction of men who have a different mission. They argue that maybe 5 to 10% of highly intelligent, incredibly disciplined Christian men must actively delay marriage.
But not to just live the bachelor life.
No, not for selfish ambition and not to enjoy the bachelor lifestyle, but because they have a civilizational duty. They must endure immense sexual discipline, stay single longer, and use that unattached time to relentlessly study, network, and infiltrate the Ivy League and elite financial and political institutions.
To get inside the machine.
Exactly. The explicit stated goal of this source is to create a vanguard, a hidden Christian aristocracy that can quietly rise to the top and eventually seize the levers of institutional power to save the country from within. It is a deliberate, multi-generational strategy of institutional and cultural warfare.
It is the cold acknowledgement that power in the modern world is not wielded by the majority. It is wielded by a credentialed institutional elite. You cannot tear down the administrative state or the Fourth Republic we discussed earlier from a homesteading farm in Kansas. You need highly trained operatives inside the shell of the hermit crab.
Going right back to that analogy.
Yes, and this ties perfectly into another source we reviewed from the channel Basecamp, which seeks to completely redefine how Christians engage with a hostile secular culture. They push back aggressively against the modern mainstream perception of Christianity as a purely pacifistic, endlessly accommodating religion.
So they reject the turn the other cheek idea.
Well, they argue that the biblical command to turn the other cheek has been dangerously misunderstood. They assert it applies strictly to minor interpersonal slights. You know, if someone insults you, you walk away. But they argue that the Old Testament rules of conflict, the defense of hard borders, and even the concepts of civilizational conquest still absolutely apply when dealing with the survival of a culture or a nation against hostile ideologies.
They advocate for adopting the survival strategies of what they provocatively call backwards people. They don't mean that as an insult. They mean it as a compliment to resilience.
Right, highly resilient communities.
They use the historical examples of certain Native American tribes, frontier communities, or even groups like the Amish or Orthodox Jewish enclaves. The strategy is to interact and trade with the outside world only when economically necessary, but to fiercely, almost ruthlessly protect the internal integrity, education, and morality of your own community.
You build a wall around your culture.
You integrate with the dominant secular culture strictly on your own terms, and you aggressively defend your borders, both physical borders and cultural boundaries, when the dominant culture threatens your long-term flourishing. It is a posture of active defensive warfare against the corrosive elements of modernity.
When you step back and synthesize all of this, from the opening economic data to this final theological strategy, the picture is stark, but it is incredibly coherent.
It all connects.
It really does. Whether you are looking at the financial system exploiting a trillion-dollar loophole to buy Bitcoin, the healthcare system mathematically punishing the poor for lacking agency, the cultural system stranding educated youth in dead-end jobs in rural towns, or religious traditionalists declaring a quiet, institutional holy war, the overarching theme is undeniable.
The old rules are gone.
The old rules of engagement, the old social contract of fairness, continuity, and mutual benefit are gone. The Fourth Republic is cracking. We are living in a chaotic, transitional era where various factions, the elites, the populists, the traditionalists, are scrambling to seize power and write the new rules of whatever comes next.
Which brings us to the most important part of the deep dive. What do you actually do with this information? We don't just want to walk you through the architecture of a collapsing system and leave you feeling overwhelmed or paralyzed.
We need actionable steps.
Right. We want to give you actionable, practical steps to navigate this landscape. So, based on the mechanisms we uncovered in today's deep dive, here are 3 things you need to do. Number 1, audit your timeline.
Your personal timeline.
Look closely, objectively, at your financial and health trajectory. Are you banking your entire future on a retirement system or a corporate pension that was built for a biological and economic reality that no longer exists?
The math doesn't lie.
Exactly.
Okay.
If the math shows that the system relies on inflation eating your savings or relies on you dying early to balance its books, you need to radically adjust your savings rate, your health habits, and your expectations today. You have to take control of your own biological and financial compounding.
And number 2, question the systems constantly. Whenever a politician, regardless of their party, tells you a massive new program is revenue neutral, or whenever a prestigious institution promises you that a $100,000 loan for a credential is guaranteed ticket to the top, look for the hidden math.
Read the fine print of reality.
Yes. Understand the mechanics of currency dilution. Understand the rapid devaluation of academic credentials. Do not simply accept the glossy, comforting surface narrative provided by the administrative state. Assume that the rules are continually being engineered to benefit the people writing them, and position yourself, your assets, and your career accordingly.
And number 3, build local resilience. Every single source we looked at today highlights a catastrophic failure of massive centralized institutions, from the Federal Reserve printing money to the National Health Service failing to mitigate stress, to the Ivy League producing indebted baristas.
The macro is failing.
If the macro systems are failing, your security lies entirely in the micro. Focus your energy on your immediate community, your family, your local parish, your neighborhood. Cultivate tangible physical skills and strong local networks that cannot be outsourced by a corporation or inflated away by a central bank.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on as you go about your day. We have discussed at length how the elites maintain the comforting theater and the illusion of the old system to prevent panic, while quietly operating a new administrative machine in the background.
Right, the hermit crab.
But psychological illusions have a shelf life. The inflation becomes too obvious, the life expectancy drops become too severe. If the social contract is truly void, what happens on the day that the vast majority of the population finally wakes up and realizes the contract they signed is worthless?
Oh, wow.
When the theater stops working and the audience refuses to clap, do we calmly sit down and negotiate a new consensus, or do we double down on the anger and fracture completely?
That is the defining question of our time. Think about that hermit crab.
Yeah.
Eventually, the borrowed shell cracks under the pressure of the new creature inside. We want to know what you think. Head down to the comments below. Where are you encountering these themes? The wealth gap, the rule breaking, the disillusionment, the retreat into localism playing out in your own life, in your own town.
We want to hear your stories.
And more importantly, how are you responding to it? What are your strategies for building resilience? And please, if you found value in this deep dive, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this morning roundup with someone who needs to hear it.
Check the links in the description to read the sources themselves and go deeper on any of the topics we covered today.
It helps us keep doing the hard work of reading the stack so you don't have to. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and we'll see you in the deep end.